1988, Sega released their third video game console, the Sega Genesis. The predecessor to this console was the Sega Master System, which you may know for having a couple of 8-bit Sonic games. And before that, there was the even more obscure SG-1000. The SG-1000 was a Japan-exclusive console released in 1983 that got a sequel 1 year later, the SG-1000-2. The SG-1000 only sold 160,000 units, and that was so bad that the console was discontinued a year after release. Anyways, the Sega Genesis had a pretty bad launch, as it was released only a week after Nintendo's Super Mario Bros. 3. The console came bundled with Altered Beast, a port of an arcade game that had come out 2 months prior. You might have heard the phrase, "Genesis does what Nintendo don't" before. Well, that was a phrase used in Sega Genesis adverts across the early to mid-90s. It was around this time that Sega began to get really competitive. Since Nintendo owned the rights to publish most arcade games of the 80s on NES, Sega used the names and likeness of celebrities and athletes in their video games. There are many examples of this, but the most famous ones are Joe Montana Football and Michael Jackson's Moonwalker. The majority of these games were released in 1990, and in late 1990, Sega began their first online service, Sega MegaNet. Sega MegaNet was the first of a couple of online services for the Sega Genesis. It started in Japan in November of 1990 and began in Brazil in 1995. The service was announced for North America under the name Telegenesis, but it never released. The service worked using the Sega Mega Modem, which is an add-on for the Sega Genesis that cost about 13,000 yen, or $100. You would also have to pay monthly for Sega MegaNet, so it's sort of like a subscription service. So how it works is the Sega Mega Modem attaches to the rear EXT 9-pin port of the rear end of the console. From the modem, a cable runs to a dual-port connector, which connects into a telephone line. From there, you're able to play a slew of MegaNet exclusive games that were released across the service's lifespan. The majority of these titles never saw physical releases outside of a few, and there were actually some Japan-exclusive collections for the Sega CD that featured MegaNet games. Overall, the Sega MegaNet had potential, but was seen as a failure and died out sometime in the 1990s. In February of 1991, Rad Mobile released in arcades. This was a Sega racing game that also had a port to the Sega Saturn in 1994 known as Gale Racer. This game is notable for being the first appearance of Sonic the Hedgehog, Sega's most successful character. And only a couple of months later, in June of 1991, Sonic the Hedgehog released and became a huge success. It became the most successful game on Genesis, selling over 15 million copies. The game also showed that Sega was a force to be reckoned with in the gaming industry. Sonic the Hedgehog went on to spawn many successful sequels, like Sonic 2, Sonic CD, and Sonic 3 and Knuckles. And by the time of Sonic and Knuckles' release in late 1994, Sega had already began their next online service for the Sega Genesis. In December of 1994, Sega launched the Sega Channel in North America. Unlike Sega MegaNet, Sega Channel didn't have any exclusive games. The Sega Channel service was just a way to play Sega Genesis games that had already come out. It also offered new content to already released games and demos for games that hadn't released yet. Sega Channel did really well. Although it was criticized harshly for its high monthly cost, at its peak, Sega Channel had 250,000 subscribers. Although, after 1998, Sega Channel was discontinued. It went well into the lifespan of the Saturn, which released in 1995. It was a failure. Why? It was $400 at launch. I can get an Xbox One S for less than that. And for a $400 console, you'd think they have some Sonic games. You know, the franchise that brought them the most success? Nope. Sonic Jam, Sonic 3D Blast, and Sonic R were the only Sonic games ever released for the Saturn, and they were all spin-offs. The day the Saturn launched in Japan was the day after the 32X launched in the US. But in October of 1996, Sega released the Sega Netlink. The Netlink was an attachment for the Saturn that gave Saturn users internet access and the ability to email through their console, which is actually pretty cool. The Netlink connected to the internet using dial-up, and it used a service called Planet Web. It had its own website and everything. There were also a few games that used the Netlink for online play, like Duke Nukem 3D and Saturn Bomberman. But despite these cool features, the Netlink was $200, and only 1% of Saturn owners actually had a Netlink, so only 50,000 were sold. But the Netlink actually continued until 2002, and this is because of SegaNet. SegaNet was the Dreamcast version of Netlink. Unlike Netlink, SegaNet did really well. By October of 2000, SegaNet had over 1.55 million registered users. In Europe, SegaNet went under a different name, Dream Arena. SegaNet supported loads of games. There's not much I have to say about SegaNet though. It was discontinued in 2002, although there are private servers for the majority of games compatible with SegaNet. Although, technically, SegaNet wasn't the only internet service for the Dreamcast. The VMU, this little thing, could actually connect to the internet and download additional content for games. This was used a lot with Sonic Adventure. There are events for Christmas, Halloween, and even Y2K. There were also crossovers with other Sega games, like Knights and Samba de Amigo. Although I'd have to say the strangest event was an event held to promote Reebok shoes. This was a Europe exclusive though. The US had an AT&T event. Many Reebok billboards were placed across levels like Emerald Coast. If you want more info on this topic, then I suggest you check out Badnik Mechanic's video on the topic. I've linked it in the description below. In conclusion, while many of the Sega Online services were seen as failures, many of them were very innovative, particularly the Sega Channel. Getting to get free games for a monthly fee makes this seem amazing. It's honestly something I'd like to see Sega come back to. I guess you could also consider Sega Cafe to be an online service, but that honestly deserves its own video. Anyways, thanks for watching and have a nice day.